Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, with last week's elections out of the way, the next big date in the political diary is, of course, the 23rd of June and the referendum on the UK's membership of the EU. For decades, this has been a huge debate inside the Conservative Party, and David Cameron said he hoped it would be conducted in a reasonable, civilised way. The Justice Secretary and leading campaigner on the Leave side, Michael Gove, is with me. Good morning to you, Mr Gove.
Good morning, Andrew.
I guess that for an awful lot of people who still haven't made up their minds, there are two huge issues they're worried about. One is economic security. Will they be better or worse off, depending on what happens? And the other is security. And I'd like to deal with both of those, as it were, today.
I understand.
Can I start off with economics? Now, virtually every single international body, IMF, OECD, World Bank, you name it, says that this country would be worse off if we left the EU. Why are they all wrong and you are right?
Well, many of these organisations were wrong in the past about the single currency. They were cheerleaders for our entry into the euro, and we were told at the time that if we stayed outside the single currency, that the City of London would be devastated and our economy would go backwards. Actually, the opposite was the case. And the truth is that these organisations are led by politicians and bureaucrats primarily, people responsible for actually generating growth and creating jobs. Business people on the ground are, as the whole country is, divided. And many of the most creative, energetic and successful business people, like Simon Wolfson, who runs Next, or Anthony Bamford and the team behind JCB, think that Britain would be stronger outside the European Union.
And you have a group of economists who agree with you, Patrick Minford being a notable one, but Patrick Minford says that British manufacturing would be virtually annihilated if we left the EU.
Well, I disagree with that, and Anthony Bamford, who's one of Britain's leading manufacturers, disagrees with that as well. But it's not just me.
If your own advisors are saying that, I mean, again, why should people believe you?
Well, there are any number of people on the Remain side who have views which are radically different from the Prime Minister. Simply because an individual chooses to back the position that I share doesn't mean that I automatically agree with his views. You know, Ken Livingstone and Gerry Adams back the Remain argument. That doesn't mean that the Prime Minister agrees with them. These are broad coalitions, and the striking thing is that if you look at some of our most successful economics ministers, Nigel Lawson, you know, a giant as a chancellor, he thinks that we'd be better off outside. And as I say, there are hundreds of business people, many of them directly involved in manufacturing, who say that we would be better off out, not least because the European Union imposes costs on our business. And Open Europe, an independent think tank, which has no dog in this fight, says that we actually face costs of £30 billion in additional regulation every year as a result of our membership of the EU.
But just because the IMF and the OECD were wrong about the euro doesn't mean they're wrong about this necessarily. And they're crammed with economists, and they're all completely convinced that we'd be worse off. They don't have a dog in this fight. They're not anti-British, they're not anti-EU, they are neutral, and they are all saying the same thing. I come back to that. There's an awful lot of very serious, very intelligent and experienced people who are telling us to stay in.
But as you yourself acknowledge, these are organisations that have made wrong calls in the past. And the IMF has made wrong calls about growth in this economy. It is ultimately...
We've all made wrong calls in the past. It doesn't mean that everything we say should then be disregarded now.
No, but it does mean that we should look at the record of these people making these predictions, and we should contrast them with the views of people who actually generate jobs and create growth.
Europe, as we've discussed, sort of affects so many things that are going on in politics at the moment. What did you think when Donald Trump went for the Brexit side of the case?
Well, it's becoming quite an odd collection of people who support Brexit around the world, isn't it? I mean, it's like Marine Le Pen and Donald Trump, and we've got George Galloway and Nigel Farage. You know,
and Boris Johnson and Michael Gove.
It's quite striking that, you know, all of our allies around the world want us to remain in. All of the major financial institutions in the world, like the IMF, think we'd be better off in. The leaders of all the mainstream political parties of Britain think we should remain in. I think everyone's got to make their own mind up. But when you make a decision, it's sometimes good to listen to what other people are saying.
And it's also the case that if we look at the arguments that are made now about how Britain might suffer outside the European Union economically, they are all arguments which are a reprise, a rerun of the original case that was made against staying outside the single currency. But more than that, you can see how countries which are outside the European Union are able to forge trade deals and to grow faster than the countries of the Eurozone. One of the striking things about the EU is that it's brought economic insecurity and massive youth unemployment to countries like Greece, Spain and Portugal.
There is, if I may say, a fundamental difference between the Eurozone, which presupposes you can have a currency union without a political union, which is therefore falling apart, a ridiculous assumption in the first place, some might say, and the single market, which is a very, very different kind entirely.
No, it's not a different thing entirely. Actually, the European Commission defines full membership of the single market as membership of Schengen and membership of the single currency. So the body that sets policy in Europe says that full membership of the single market requires you to be in the single currency. More than that, the European Commission and its other leaders in Europe have established a report, the Five Presidents report. Anyone can read it, anyone can Google it. It is clear that the European Union, once this referendum is out of the way, if Britain votes to remain, wants to press ahead, not just with more countries entering the euro, but with a banking union and a fiscal union, and it wants to exercise more control over banking regulation and taxes across Europe.
Are you saying that if we vote to stay in the EU, then the EU will grab control of our tax system?
I think there is a real danger that if we vote to remain, that the Five Presidents report and the fact that the countries which are in the Eurozone have a majority within the EU mean that we could lose autonomy economically. One of the terrible things about the dynamic within the EU is that those countries which have suffered most as a result of the euro haven't learnt any lessons, haven't said that they want to change, they want to deepen integration, and they have a majority within the EU, which means that they can impose policies on us.
So you think that the deal negotiated by the Prime Minister, which appears to give us special opt-outs and special protections, actually the reverse will happen. We will be drawn in by a ratchet, and that he's completely wrong about that?
Well, there are many things that the Prime Minister's done in our relationship with Europe which are good, but one of the problems with the deal is that we actually give up the right to veto other countries progressing towards greater integration. And I think that's one of the reasons why it is safer for us to vote leave. Because if we vote leave, then we're in a position to dictate the terms in Britain's economic interest.
Before we leave the economics, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, you mentioned the previous Chancellor, the current Chancellor, says that every family in this country will be £4,200 worse off if we vote to leave. And he says that is a fact.
Well, this is one area where I disagree with George. I think he's an outstanding Chancellor. I think he's a brilliant politician. But this is the one area where we do disagree. It's
not just about disagreeing, though, is it? It's whether it's true or not. I mean, people are casting around for some desperate handhold of fact. Well, and he says, here is a handhold, it's a fact.
It's a projection. What is a fact is that we give more than £350 million to the European Union and hand over control of that money to the European Union every week. That is a fact.
It's not a fact, because actually we get...
It is. The Office of National Statistics...
but they also say the rebate has to be taken into account, and we get back from that. And when you take account transfers into business, and it's about £200 off that.
But two critical things. The EU control both of those. The rebate is not in any treaty. The rebate can be whittled away. And secondly, the money that the European Union spends in this country, yes, that's welcome. But the European Union decides. They control that £350 million every week. If we vote leave, we can control how that money is spent.
Well, we'll see. Let me ask you, just before we leave the economics, actually, a very simple question I have tried to get an answer to from various people on your side is, should we or should we not be inside the single market? Do you want us to stay inside the single market, yes or no?
No, we should be outside the single market. We should have access to the single market, but we should not be governed by the rules that the European Court of Justice imposes on us, which cost business and restrict freedom.
So the European Court of Justice is something that you've been focusing on again today when it comes to the other security matter. Now, your proposal is that before we actually formally leave the EU, post-referendum, we should have emergency legislation to get us out from under the ECJ, correct?
Absolutely right.
Now, is that not breaking our international treaty obligations? In other words, we're still inside the EU and we are unilaterally removing ourselves from the ECJ. And will that not cause a great deal of anger and irritation just at the time we're trying to have a helpful, friendly, considerate negotiation?
Absolutely not. When we vote leave, that is a clear mandate, a democratic decision that the European Union will, I'm sure, respect. And of course, there are all sorts of things that we will negotiate with our European partners in our interests and in theirs. But we can take immediate steps in order to make this country safer. At the moment, the European Court of Justice has interfered in our capacity to share data and intelligence with our American allies. The European Court of Justice has interfered to prevent us deporting people whose presence here is not conducive to the public good.
John Sawyer says this is absolutely untrue. You heard him earlier on in the programme.
Well, I have enormous respect for Sir John and his traditional public service, but he's flat wrong. The ECJ, a court, has intervened specifically to say that data sharing arrangements that we had passed in Parliament were wrong. And therefore, we have to wait for the judgment of the European Court of Justice to decide how our data and our information and our intelligence can be shared with our American allies. I think that is wrong. And it is clear that intelligence experts, from Richard Dearlove
the head
to
of
Richard
MI6
Walton,
is nothing if not an intelligence expert.
Intelligence
and he
experts,
disagrees with you on this.
He does, but there are other people who disagree with John. So Ron Noble, who's the head of Interpol, says that the European Union's open borders policy is like hanging out a welcome sign for terrorists. Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI6, says that open borders policy and also the way in which European courts operate is against our interests. Richard Walton, the most recent head of anti-terrorism at the Met, says that we would suffer not one whit by being outside the EU.
What about Sir John's point that we only know which bad guys are coming in because we are sharing intelligence across the EU, and that Brussels has been incredibly helpful in this?
Well, actually,
I mean, he's been there. He must.
I'm there. I'm the Justice Secretary. I know that the European Criminal Records Information System, ECRIS, doesn't allow us to know whether or not criminals come into this country. We only find out whether or not people have criminal records after they've already committed an offence in this country. It's a gossamer-thin protection. And we do also know that the most valuable intelligence sharing that we have is with the other countries of the Five Eyes, the Anglosphere, America, Australia, New Zealand and Canada. The truth is that within the European Union, intelligence sharing doesn't work effectively. Even within Belgium, you can't get the police and the security services within Belgium to share intelligence effectively. So we would be safer if we were outside the European Union, had control of our borders, and we did not have European judges telling us who we can and cannot deport.
I'm not going to follow you down the slippery road of what's going on or not going on inside the Belgian security services.
Of course.
But I do want to come back, if you don't mind me dotting around a bit, to what you said earlier on about the single market, because you said we should not be in the single market. You're very clear about that, but we should have access to it. So your idea is that we would negotiate a new deal to be inside the single market. Do you accept that that will come with a price?
No, we have a free trade arrangement. I think it is the case that free trade prevails across the European continent.
We'd work under WTO rules.
No, we'd have at the moment, there are no tariffs between the United Kingdom and other countries in the European Union.
Because we're inside the EU.
Exactly. Why should we seek to impose those tariffs when we're outside?
But if once we're outside, we either have to negotiate a new agreement with the EU or we don't. I mean, those agreements become null and void once we leave. That's the point of leaving.
But I think this is a misunderstanding that many people have. If you negotiate a trade agreement with a country with whom you currently have tariffs, then you need to negotiate which tariffs will remain and which will be reduced. If you don't have tariffs, then both sides can accept there is no need to erect them. And German car manufacturers are not going to want to have tariffs erected when they sell many more cars to us than we sell to them. And I cannot imagine a situation where if any individual nation within the European Union wanted to erect tariffs, that others would let them.
Well, this is a massive question for our country, for all the people who live in this country, about who we want to be as a nation, about our economy. And actually, I think today we're getting to the heart of the matter. We've just had the Leave campaign admit this morning that Britain would leave the single market. That's the largest free trade area in the world. That would be catastrophic for people's jobs and their incomes and their livelihoods. Now, some people might think wrecking the economy is a price worth paying. I absolutely reject that.
Is it, just to be clear, because you know, I want to be sort of look at your language for a bit. You think it would be catastrophic because most of the forecasts show we would be poorer relative to where we would be, but there would still be growth. There would just be less growth. That's not catastrophic, is it?
Well, I think there's, first of all, a long-term cost, you know, equivalent to around £4,300 per family if we lose.
But relative to where we would otherwise be?
Look, if we leave the single market, actually, our analysis says we'd be worse off than that. And there's a short-term hit. I think it's very important for people to think about that, and we're going to be producing some more research on that in the coming weeks. And it's already clear from the Treasury analysis that, for example, there would be a significant shock to the housing market, that would hit the value of people's homes, that would hit the cost of mortgages. That's backed up by research from banks.
Can you quantify that?
Well, we'll see. We're doing the work on it now, but the emerging Treasury analysis backs up what you're hearing from major banks like Virgin Money, that the value of people's homes would be affected, and people trying to get on the housing market would be hit because mortgage costs would go up.
So
it's just an example. I mean, if I can say, Robert,
Yeah.
it's just an example that this isn't just a big question about who we are as a country.
No.
It also goes to the heart of people's financial security.